Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee tailor and a complex political figure who became one of the most controversial presidents in American history. Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States and the first to be impeached, was born in Raleigh, North Carolina on December 29, 1808. He came from poverty and illiteracy. He had a determined personality and an uncompromising nature. Johnson's early years were marked by hardship and struggle. He never attended school and was apprenticed to a tailor at age 10. His education came from listening to others read and eventually teaching himself, with help from his wife. This lack of formal education would shape his worldview and contribute to his lifelong identification with common people, though his later career would test those loyalties in the most challenging ways imaginable. After completing his apprenticeship, Johnson fled to Tennessee to escape his indenture contract. He settled in Greenville, Tennessee in 1826, where he established a tailor shop. It was in Greenville that Johnson married Eliza McCardle in 1827. She was 16 years old and had received some education. Eliza taught her husband to read and write more proficiently and helped him with arithmetic. The marriage would last until her death and produce 5 children. Johnson's tailor shop became a gathering place for local men to discuss politics and current events. Johnson would work at his trade while engaging in debates and discussions. These conversations fueled his interest in politics and helped him develop his skills as a speaker and debater. Despite his lack of formal education, Johnson proved to be intelligent and quick-witted, able to hold his own in arguments with more educated men. Johnson's political career began at the local level. In 1828, he was elected as an alderman in Greenville. He served in that position for several years before being elected mayor in 1834. These early political experiences taught him the mechanics of government and the importance of connecting with voters. Johnson positioned himself as a champion of the working man, the artisan, and laborer who formed the backbone of Tennessee society. His message resonated with voters who saw in him one of their own. In 1835, Johnson was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. He served one term before being elected to the Tennessee Senate in 1841. During his time in the state legislature, Johnson advocated for the rights of small farmers and workers against what he perceived as the aristocratic planter class. He supported public education and internal improvements. His political philosophy was rooted in Jacksonian democracy, emphasizing limited government, states' rights, and opposition to concentrated wealth and power. Johnson's political rise continued in 1843 when he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He would serve 5 terms in Congress, representing Tennessee's 1st District. In Washington, Johnson remained true to his working-class roots and his strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. He opposed protective tariffs, which he believed benefited northern manufacturers at the expense of southern farmers. He supported the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery into new territories, reflecting the views of his constituents. One of Johnson's signature issues in Congress was his advocacy for a Homestead Act. He believed that public land should be given free to settlers who would work them rather than sold to speculators. This position put him at odds with many Southern Democrats who feared that free land in the West would create more free states and upset the sectional balance of power. Johnson persisted in his advocacy for homesteading, seeing it as a way to help poor white farmers achieve economic independence. His support for this measure demonstrated both his commitment to his principles and his willingness to break with his party when he believed he was right. In 1853, Johnson was elected governor of Tennessee. He served 2 two-year terms, focusing on education reform and fiscal responsibility. As governor, he continued to champion the interests of small farmers and workers. He also became involved in the growing sectional tensions over slavery. Johnson was a slaveholder himself, owning several enslaved people throughout his life. However, his support for slavery was pragmatic rather than ideological. He defended the institution as it existed in the South but did not advocate for its expansion with the fervor of fire-eating secessionists. After his gubernatorial service, Johnson was elected to the United States Senate in 1857. In the Senate, he found himself caught between the increasingly radical positions on both sides of the slavery question. Johnson remained a Democrat and a defender of Southern rights, but but he was also a staunch Unionist who believed in the perpetuity of the Federal Union. This position would define the rest of his political career and make him a unique figure in American history. When the secession crisis erupted following Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, Johnson faced the most important decision of his life. Tennessee, like other Southern states, debated whether to leave the Union. Johnson, despite being a Southern Democrat and slaveholder, opposed secession vehemently. He argued that secession was illegal and that it betrayed the Constitution. He gave passionate speeches defending the Union and attacking secessionists as traitors. His position was deeply unpopular in Tennessee and throughout the South. He received death threats and was burned in effigy. His family in Tennessee faced harassment and danger. When Tennessee voted to secede in June 1861, Johnson refused to resign his Senate seat. He was the only Southern senator to remain in Congress after his state seceded. This decision made him a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. Johnson's loyalty to the Union, despite his Southern background and Democratic politics, made him invaluable to the Lincoln administration. He became a symbol of Southern Unionism and proof that not all Southerners supported the rebellion. In March 1862, Lincoln appointed Johnson as military governor of Tennessee. Union forces had captured much of the state, and Lincoln needed someone to restore loyal civil government. Johnson accepted the difficult and dangerous assignment. As military governor, he faced the challenge of governing a state torn by civil war, where Confederate sympathizers remained active and Union control was tenuous. Johnson ruled with an iron hand, arresting suspected Confederate sympathizers, suppressing disloyal newspapers, and requiring loyalty oaths from citizens seeking to do business or practice professions. Johnson's tenure as military governor was controversial. His methods were often harsh and arbitrary. He showed little tolerance for those who had supported secession, even after they claimed to have returned to loyalty. He believed that treason should be punished and that those who had led Tennessee into rebellion should face consequences. At the same time, he worked to organize a loyal state government and to bring Tennessee back into the Union. He encouraged the formation of Union military units from Tennessee residents and supported efforts to abolish slavery in the state. By 1864, as Lincoln prepared for re-election, the president needed to broaden his political appeal. The Republican Party temporarily renamed itself the National Union Party to attract war Democrats and border state Unionists. Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate, replacing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin. The selection made political sense. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, exactly the kind of figure who could demonstrate that the war was not a partisan or sectional conflict but a defense of the Constitution. The Lincoln-Johnson ticket won the election of 1864, defeating Democratic candidate George McClellan. Johnson was inaugurated as vice president on March 4, 1865. The inauguration became infamous because Johnson appeared intoxicated during the ceremony. He had been ill with typhoid fever and had taken whiskey as medicine before the event. The alcohol affected him more strongly than he expected, and he gave a rambling, incoherent speech that embarrassed himself and the administration. Lincoln defended Johnson, attributing the incident to illness and exhaustion, but the damage to Johnson's reputation was significant. Johnson served as vice president for only 6 weeks. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning, and Andrew Johnson became President of the United States. He assumed office at one of the most critical moments in American history. The Civil War had just ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9. The nation faced the enormous challenge of reconstructing the South and integrating millions of formerly enslaved people into American society as free citizens. Johnson's presidency would be defined by his approach to Reconstruction and his conflict with Congress over how to restore the Southern states to the Union. Johnson believed in a lenient policy toward the defeated Confederacy. He issued a series of proclamations offering amnesty to most former Confederates who would take a loyalty oath. He appointed provisional governors in Southern states and allowed them to organize new governments. His only requirements were that the states ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, repudiate secession, and void Confederate debts. Johnson's Reconstruction policy reflected his political philosophy and his prejudices. He believed in states' rights and limited federal power. He wanted to restore the southern states to their former position in the Union as quickly as possible with minimal federal interference. He also held deeply racist views about African Americans. He did not believe that black people were equal to white people or that they should have political rights. He opposed efforts to give freed slaves the right to vote or to provide them with federal protection or assistance. Under Johnson's lenient policies, southern states quickly organized new governments. However, these governments were dominated by former Confederate leaders and passed laws known as Black Codes that severely restricted the rights of freed slaves. The Black Codes varied by state but generally attempted to recreate slavery in all but name, forcing freed people into labor contracts, restricting their movement, and denying them basic civil rights. Violence against freed slaves and white Unionists increased throughout the South. Congress, controlled by Republicans, was outraged by Johnson's policies and the situation in the South. When Congress reconvened in December 1865, Republicans refused to seat representatives and senators from the former Confederate states. They established the Joint Committee on Reconstruction to investigate conditions in the South and develop alternative policies. The stage was set for a confrontation between the President and Congress over who would control Reconstruction policy. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens and had certain fundamental rights regardless of race. Johnson vetoed the bill, arguing that it violated states' rights and that Congress should not pass such legislation while the southern states were unrepresented. Congress overrode his veto, the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. The override demonstrated that Johnson had lost control of Reconstruction policy. Congress followed with the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to all persons born in the United States and promised equal protection under the law. The amendment was designed to protect the rights of freed slaves and prevent states from denying civil rights based on race. Johnson opposed the amendment and encouraged southern states to reject it. His opposition further alienated him from congressional Republicans and demonstrated his commitment to white supremacy. In the 1866 midterm elections, Johnson campaigned against congressional Republicans, undertaking a speaking tour known as the Swing Around the Circle. The tour was a disaster. Johnson engaged in undignified arguments with hecklers and gave intemperate speeches attacking his opponents. His behavior shocked many Americans who expected presidential dignity. Republicans won overwhelming victories in the elections, gaining more than a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress. The election results gave Republicans the power to override any presidential veto and to pursue their own Reconstruction policies without Johnson's cooperation. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's vetoes. These acts divided the South into military districts, required new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage, and mandated ratification of the 14th Amendment before states could be readmitted to the Union. The acts represented a complete repudiation of Johnson's lenient policies and established congressional control over Reconstruction. Johnson was required to enforce laws he opposed, creating an impossible situation. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which prohibited the president from removing certain office holders without Senate approval. The act was designed to protect Republican appointees from being fired by Johnson. The constitutionality of the act was questionable, but Congress passed it over Johnson's veto. The act would become the basis for Johnson's impeachment. Johnson continued to obstruct congressional Reconstruction policies. He interpreted the Reconstruction Acts as narrowly as possible, appointed commanders sympathetic to white Southerners, and used his position to undermine Republican efforts. In August 1867, while Congress was in recess, Johnson suspended Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had been working with congressional Republicans. Johnson appointed General Ulysses Grant as interim secretary. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's removal, Grant resigned and Stanton reclaimed his office. Johnson then fired Stanton in February 1868, in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act. The firing of Stanton provided the pretext congressional Republicans needed. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Johnson. The articles of impeachment charged him primarily with violating the Tenure of Office Act, though they also included more general charges of bringing disgrace to the presidency and attempting to undermine congressional authority. Johnson became the first president in American history to be impeached. The Senate trial began in March 1868 and lasted 11 weeks. Johnson did not attend the trial but was represented by capable attorneys who argued that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional and that Johnson had not violated it in any case since Stanton had been appointed by Lincoln, not Johnson. The trial became a national sensation, with packed galleries and extensive press coverage. The outcome would determine not just Johnson's fate but the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. On May 16 and again on May 26, the Senate voted on the articles of impeachment. The Constitution requires a two-thirds majority to convict. Republicans held 42 seats, exactly the two-thirds needed if all voted to convict. However, 7 Republican senators voted not guilty, believing that the charges did not constitute high crimes and misdemeanors or fearing the precedent of removing a president for political disagreements. The final vote was 35-19, one vote short of the two-thirds needed for conviction. Andrew Johnson remained president, but his power was broken. Johnson served out the remainder of his term as a lame-duck president. He continued to oppose congressional reconstruction but lacked the power to affect policy. In the 1868 election, Republicans nominated Ulysses Grant for president. Grant won easily, and Johnson left office in March 1869. He did not attend Grant's inauguration, maintaining his bitter opposition to Republican policies to the end. After leaving the presidency, Johnson returned to Tennessee. He remained active in politics, seeking vindication for his presidency. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1869 and for the Senate in 1871. His political career seemed over. However, in 1874, the Tennessee legislature elected him to the United States Senate, making him the only former president to serve in the Senate after leaving the White House. His election was seen as a personal triumph and a measure of vindication. Johnson returned to Washington in March 1875 for a special session of the Senate. He gave a speech attacking the Grant administration's Reconstruction policies and defending his own record. It was his final political statement. On July 31, 1875, while visiting his daughter in Carter County, Tennessee, Andrew Johnson suffered a stroke and died. He was 66 years old. Johnson's funeral was held in Greenville, Tennessee. He was buried wrapped in an American flag with a copy of the Constitution under his head, symbols of the Union he had defended and the document he had claimed to uphold throughout his career. Thousands attended his funeral, reflecting his status as a significant if controversial figure in American history. Johnson's legacy is almost entirely negative. Historians consistently rank him among the worst presidents in American history. His lenient Reconstruction policies allowed the restoration of white supremacy in the South and betrayed the freed slaves who had looked to the federal government for protection. His racism and his opposition to civil rights for African Americans contributed to nearly a century of segregation and discrimination. His obstruction of congressional reconstruction created a constitutional crisis that nearly destroyed the presidency. Modern historians recognize that Johnson faced an extraordinarily difficult situation. He assumed office at a moment of national crisis with no electoral mandate and no political base. He was a Democrat governing with a Republican Congress. He was a Southerner trying to restore the South while maintaining Northern support. However, these circumstances do not excuse his failures. Johnson's rigid adherence to states' rights and white supremacy, his inability to compromise, and his personal animosity toward his opponents made a bad situation worse. Perhaps the most damning verdict on Johnson's presidency is what happened in the South after his policies failed. The brief period of Reconstruction that followed congressional action saw African Americans voting, holding office, and exercising their rights as citizens. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, white Southerners systematically stripped black citizens of these rights through violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws. The Jim Crow system that emerged would last until the 1960s. Johnson's opposition to protecting the rights of freed slaves contributed directly to this tragic outcome. Johnson represents a particular type of political leader, the principled man whose principles are fundamentally wrong. He genuinely believed in his interpretation of the Constitution and in limited federal power. He sincerely thought that his policies were correct. However, his principles were rooted in racism and a political philosophy that could not address the reality of post-Civil War America. His tragedy was not that he betrayed his beliefs, but that his beliefs led him to betray the promise of freedom that the Civil War had created. In the end, Andrew Johnson was a self-made man who rose from poverty to the presidency through determination and political skill, only to fail catastrophically when given the opportunity to shape the nation's future. His legacy includes the first presidential impeachment and a Reconstruction policy that abandoned millions of freed slaves to violence and oppression. He is remembered today primarily for his failures, which is perhaps fitting for a president whose actions had such devastating consequences for so many Americans. Johnson died believing he had defended the Constitution and the rights of states, but history has judged that he defended only the right of white Southerners to oppress Black Americans.